You're listening to the Active Mom Podcast with host Dr. Carrie Pagliano. I'm a mom, physical therapist, and your go-to guide for staying active with pelvic health issues in pregnancy, postpartum, perimenopause, and beyond. Whether you're a fellow mom, physical therapist, or women's health professional, join me where I'll share expert insights, real-life stories, and the latest research to help you approach running, CrossFit, yoga, Pilates, HIIT, or whatever activity you love with confidence and evidence-informed guidance. Let's start the show. All right, I am so excited to introduce our next guest. Beth Rodden is a climber, like a super famous climber, and I am not in the climbing space, so I didn't know this until I met her. And she's an author of A Light Through the Cracks, where she shares her journey, kind of coming up as a climber, and she's been really open about talking about just navigating it as a woman and all the funny or not so funny pelvic health things that go on as we age as an athlete. So, Beth Rodden, welcome to the Active Mom Podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
All right, you're going to do a much better introduction than I did. So, tell us a little bit about who you are, where you're from, and what you do.
Yeah, my name is Beth. I'm a climber. I've been a professional climber, gosh, since I was a teenager, probably. And it's morphed over the years. But I live in California in Yosemite, and I'm still climbing and still somehow managing to make the professional thing work. So that's me.
Love it. Love it. I admit, I knew nothing or very little about climbing when we met, and you've done a lot to educate me in more ways than you would know. But let's just jump back a little bit about as you were coming up in the climbing scene, like were there a lot of women doing what you were doing? And then kind of as you became a mom, what was kind of the scene at that point?
Yeah, so when I started climbing, it was in the mid 90s. And it was very rare for me to have another woman to climb with. There were women at the climbing gym that I grew up in, but no one my age, no one really even close to my age. And I would say it was probably like a 80-20 split between men versus women. And which as a teenager, I was a active teenager and I was a tomboy. Like it didn't really impact me, I feel like at the time. Um, but as I went through my career, it was really apparent that being a woman was much different than being a man in the same industry. I got paid much less. There was usually only one woman, the token woman on a athlete team, a company's team. Usually, only one woman got to go on an expedition. It was kind of like we were the diversity that they needed to check the box.
Mm,
So, so I kind of went through my career like that, and I stood out because I was able to climb climbs that men couldn't do, or that I was keeping up with the men. um, but as I got into my 30s and started to think about a family, there wasn't really a role model I could look to, because most of the women that came before me and kind of you know broke the barriers before me, that women could be professional climbers. They either bowed out gracefully, before they had kids, or they got dropped by their sponsors.
mm.
So it was a pretty it felt like pretty treacherous waters to try and think and hope that I could continue this career, when most of the other women couldn't.
Yeah, no, I feel like there's so many parallel sports stories that we hear about, with runners and other athletes that first of all, it was can you be in that space? And then, okay, now you can be there, but if you're going to get pregnant, we're out. We're not going to support you through that. With climbing specifically, I would imagine, was there a lot of judgment with people thinking, hey, you can't climb if you're going to be pregnant or things like that?
Yeah, I think that before I, took the leap and became pregnant, that was the undercurrent in every conversation. People, it was kind of referred to in a derogatory way.
Yeah.
People would gasp and say, "Oh gosh, that's terrible," when somebody would say they were pregnant, or they'd be
Oh.
like, "Oh, you'll never be able to climb hard again." It was just that was the dialogue that was in
Yeah,
our community. It was just like it
that was
was
normal.
it was normal. It was like an injury. It was a career ending thing. It was something terrible.
Yeah. So what if this is gonna be this career-ending thing, like, what made you make the leap, and then how'd you navigate it?
I towards, early mid 30s, I started having a lot of injuries around climbing. And so I was kind of going through this transition in climbing anyways, where I really wanted to keep it at the same level, in the same relationship that I had for, 15 years prior in my 20s and my late teens. But my body was just, kind of breaking down in a lot of ways that a lot of people, experience. I was overtrained. I was doing it in not smart ways. And so I felt like I was in this position anyways, where I was wondering, do I keep pushing and having my body break down? Or do I kind of redefine my relationship with climbing?
Mm,
And I always would ask myself, several times a year, is it worth is this climb worth whatever I'm putting my body through? And the answer was always yes. Of course it is, because then
yeah,
this is your career, this is what you love,
right.
and then at some point it became, would you rather do this route? Like if you're, 80 years old or whatnot, and you're looking back, or would you regret more not doing this route, or would you regret more not trying to have a family? And at some point that answer switched to, this route doesn't mean as much to me as potentially, trying to have a family. And
Those
so
are
then,
big questions.
yeah.
That's a big question.
Yeah, it is. It is. But I
Did
think at
you
some point everybody has to kind of ask that of themselves.
Yeah, but not everybody has to rely upon their body for their day job either. I mean, I could still keep doing what I was doing and not worry so much about it. Like, was that did you think, "Hey, I'm gonna see if I can keep climbing through, or I'm gonna step off," or what was that experience for you?
I feel like I had some preconceived notions of what pregnancy would be like to me, of what postpartum would be like to me, of what,
Yeah.
being a new mother would be. And I've kind of felt like it would be, I was a professional athlete. And so this should be no big deal. I'll have the kid and then just get back to it, because that's what I do. Like I'm
Right.
good at, manipulating my body and using it to do my career. So I kind of felt like that.
Mm,
But then I had a really rough physical postpartum. Um, and so I think that really changed. And I think career wise too, I did think that I'd be able to get back to climbing hard, doing my career. Luckily, with climbing, um, there's no one way to do it.
mhm,
It's less organized than say running or swimming, where you kind of do your thing athletically, and then maybe you move on to announcing or something like that, or
mhm,
coaching or whatnot. With climbing, you can kind of make your own path a little bit, and you can still work with sponsors to provide content, to do events,
mhm.
to do product development. So I thought there might be some path that I could pursue.
Yeah. So you're like, "I'll figure this out. It'll be fine."
Yeah, or I didn't know it'd be fine, but I was like, I'm gonna try and we'll see what happens.
Well, clearly it was fine, but you've had some rough things to kinda navigate. Let's back up to kinda talking about birth and postpartum because, I hear that a lot, and again, DC here, we have, we joke about a lot of older moms where you've been able to control things in your life this whole time, and then you get into postpartum, and sometimes delivery didn't go the way you wanted, or your kid's having feeding issues, sleeping issues, whatever it is, and you realize these things are sort of out of your hands to some degree. Like, what was that like mentally to go as a pro athlete to now navigating these uncertain waters of parenthood, and am I going to get back to you know who I was before.
Yeah, I think the hardest part for me was it just took me by surprise, right?
Yeah.
No one was, at least in my sphere, right? No one that I knew or was following or whatever talked about any potential issues postpartum, right? Like
Mhm.
I literally, what I heard was labor was hard, which it was, but also like the most amazing thing that you can grow and produce this human. But then it was kind of like that was it, and then they just
Right.
went on. They went on with their lives. They never talked about issues with breastfeeding. They never talked about any prolapse issues or anything, anything with their abs. And so that was really the hardest thing is I just I felt really alone and really abnormal. And so
Yeah.
I was, laying in bed and I couldn't walk without feeling like everything was going to fall out. We had big issues breastfeeding. Our son had tongue tie, so I had all these mastitis infections until we could figure it out. Um, and so I just felt like there was something wrong with me,
Mm,
and it wasn't something that I could fix. And so
right.
not only was I like upset and sleep deprived and navigating the whole world of being a new mom, but then I also felt like I had all this stuff wrong with me.
Yeah.
Um, and it wasn't like my OB said, "Oh, it's you have a cystocele and this." It's like I had to be the proactive one, to
Right.
go. And so it was hard because I was like, should I even complain about this? Maybe this is normal, and
Right.
I just need to suck it up, type of thing.
Yeah. Well, and just for a point of reference, like your son is how old now?
He's 10.
Yeah. So he's not that old. Like this
Yeah.
wasn't that long ago. But it's so interesting to me, not in a good way, but like how there's even now still these pockets of space where 10 years ago you were feeling that way. Um, and knowing there was, for you to put that blame on yourself, it's just heart wrenching, to not know that it's not just you. When did you kind of like, or how did you kind of navigate that process? Your kid's getting older. You want to be more active. This is your job. Like, how did you navigate that process?
For me, so at first I felt like I was isolated in like a very dark hole all by myself. Um, But then I just started talking about it, and I would slowly start to hear people, like a couple friends might have had, like distant friends had couple of
Yep.
same issues. And then I started, talking about it with other friends who might know a pelvic floor PT, or who, would know a lactation consultant that could help us with all that, diagnosing a tongue tie, and why am I bleeding, why am I, you know
Right.
um because every time I would like text a friend and be like, when did it stop hurting, I have like
Right.
toe curling pain at 4 weeks, and I'm, have all these infections, and they were like, oh, it just took, X amount of days or something. And I thought that. So once I
Mhm.
started, I was just like, I can't just live in this hole all by
Yeah.
myself. So I just started talking about it. And I did find a couple people, and I really connected with them, and I really bonded with them. And then I did get referred to a PT, and
Mhm.
and that helped. And then, started slowly coming back. But it took a long time. I wasn't, running until over a year probably postpartum.
Yeah.
Um, and it's not like I'm a professional runner, so it wasn't I just started really slow, and tried
Yeah.
to run a mile and things like that.
Yeah. As far as the climbing community, like the people that you found, were they in that space or were they outside of that space that you found as kind of supporters?
There no professional climbers, so I didn't find
Yeah.
anybody that could kind of relate in that way. They were kind of,
Yeah.
I had people tell me, "Oh, labor and delivery was like a half day of training," and then that was it.
Oh my
There's
gosh.
like no recovery whatsoever.
Yeah.
Um, so the people that I connected with, one's a climber. It's not what she does full time, and then another one is an athlete, but not a professional. And but still, it was just like a new mom that could understand,
Yeah.
not like a seamless postpartum, which is what
Yeah.
90% of my connections had, was a seamless postpartum.
Yeah. Well, I feel like that's one of the hardest things about, navigating birth trauma and birth injuries and things like that versus like a shoulder injury where you can have a very open conversation with male colleagues about a shoulder injury and they can relate and, have advice and you don't feel like you have to keep that to yourself. But any sort of pelvic injury, it's almost like and even, navigating lactation issues, like no guy wants to hear about that. My daughter, same deal, tongue tie, and it was my second round through, and I was like, "Oh, I know how to do this." Toe curling, I think that's such the perfect Like, I still have PTSD when I'm thinking about her coming towards me. I'm like, "Oh my god, it hurts so bad." But again, like, you have those people that, like, this as soon as you said toe curl, I'm like, "Yep, all came back." Like, that when they hear those words, they connect and they be like, "Oh, no, that's this or it's this." Like, do you have people now that because you were kind of a model for them coming up through, do you have people reaching back to you now?
Yeah, absolutely. The climbing community is very cross generational, right? Like
Mhm.
I climb with people who are 20 and I climb with people who are 60. And so we have a lot of friends that are having kids now. And,
Yeah.
the same thing, I'll have friends that come up and they say, I can't, my prolapse, like my pelvic floor, it hurts so bad. And I'm 4 months postpartum. Um, and just to be able to actually have someone to talk to about that. And
Yeah.
I feel a little bit bad now because I'm like, oh yeah, now I'm having issues again because of perimenopause.
Thank you, perimenopause.
Yeah, I'm not like the shining light that's like it gets better and you're fine. I'm kind of like it gets better and then it doesn't for a little while.
If it makes you feel any better, I kind of feel the same way because, as you know, I crash landed into perimenopause about a year ago, and like I feel like I'm like, great, I'm doing great, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, it'd be like, okay, teenage murder scene, breakthrough bleeding, or the alternative is you up your progesterone, and now you have like face peeling, burning rosacea. Like I'm still looking for it too. So which goes to say there is no perfect pathway for it, but at least people listen and you understand when you say those words.
Totally. Yeah, no, totally. I just think the more we talk about it, and I feel
Yeah.
like that's been my experience because now people do talk about it. There's like trainers in climbing now
Mhm.
that specifically train postpartum, like
Yeah.
post prenatal and postpartum women, and that was never the case before. It was just like
No.
all male trainers or all female trainers who only knew how to train the male way.
Right.
And so I remember when I was, I don't know, like 10 months postpartum, a year and a half postpartum, I've never used a coach before because climbing was just so new when
Mhm.
I was doing it. But now, it was getting more sophisticated 10 years ago. And I was like, maybe I'll try having a coach, make it help me make a training plan because now I want to get back into it after,
Right.
I was feeling kind of recovered from breastfeeding and the cystocele. And and I remember talking to the male coach and I was telling him, I was like, I'm still nursing, so like my joints are still loose. And it was just like he said, yeah, he was just like, I think you need to find someone else. And you're like, oh, now I kind of feel bad.
But you know what? At least he didn't just ignore it and be like, "All right, well, I mean, I don't know if that's a lesser 2 evils that you got,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, but it's
yeah.
still like just the talk about it more, it's nice
Yeah.
because now there's actually people that know how to train
Mhm.
postpartum women and
Yep.
know what to look for. And yeah, maybe the more we talk about it now, in like 10 years, there'll be people who know how to train perimenopausal women and that type of
Right.
thing. So,
I hope that learning curve is a little faster. Uh,
yeah.
I don't wanna do this again. No, I mean, and I totally appreciate that you're saying, like, "Hey, this is just in the last 10 years or so," because, again, I feel like a lot of people that are new to postpartum or new to working with postpartum patients don't realize that this is very, very recent history. And, you know, you being one of the only climbers in your space, period, as a woman, like you having a space there was so new not that long ago. And then to come into that space and navigate it postpartum and now in perimenopause, like this is, I don't think people realize that they're witnessing history. And they think it just always has been like women have always been climbing, women have always been navigating, running postpartum. Like, no, this is really new because we had to fight to get those spaces. Does that ever occur to you, like, from time to time where you're like, "No, I'm at the tip of the spear here," because you kind of have always done that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think in the moment, I never thought that I was kind of at the tip of the spear. I mean, maybe when it came to pregnancy and postpartum a little bit.
Yeah.
just because sadly the generation before me, they weren't afforded that opportunity that I
Right.
was, you know? I
Right.
I took the leap, and a lot of them tried to take the leap, and they had a different outcome with their sponsors.
Yeah.
And I think that's just probably society was not caught up to where they were, which is, really sad when you think about it. And now in perimenopause and trying to talk about it, um, I don't, again, because it hasn't really been done before, I'm always wondering, like, well, maybe this is the time that the sponsors do, bow out, and it's not. And so I'm never
Mm.
thinking like I'm doing this and it's going to work. I'm just like, well, I'm going to do it and we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
I feel like I don't ever expect a certain result. Obviously, I hope for a certain result, but
Yeah.
yeah, because there's no history to fall back on,
Right.
so
Yeah, if they haven't canceled you over talking about prolapse or all this other stuff, like, let's just keep going, right?
exactly. Yeah, exactly.
No, so have you had, women I refer to it as vintage, um, reach out to you with any concerns about because what I have learned from you is when you guys do your lower climb because whenever I think of climbing I think you're just climbing El Cap all day. I've now learned that you do these lower, more intricate climbs, and then you're falling on mats on the ground. Is Do you ever have people concerned about stress fractures with menopause induced osteoporosis or things like that? Do those questions sort of come up? Or are you just like, we've been falling on mats for a long time. This is just what we do.
That's a really good question. I feel like the stress fracture conversation or osteoporosis hasn't come up
Mhm.
um, with me, but the prolapse conversation
Yeah, let's talk
has.
about that.
Yeah. So even, I feel like I went through this kind of period. I had pretty bad prolapse symptoms for about a year postpartum. Obviously, they improved that during that year, but I wouldn't
Mhm,
say like I'd never thought about it until after a year postpartum.
mhm,
And then I feel like I had a good 9 years where I rarely thought about it.
mhm,
I would think about it, sometimes on my period I could feel symptoms. Um, but then there were times during bouldering, which is the lower climbing where you climb up and then you fall. There were a couple bouldering trips where I was climbing like higher problems and falling, and it would catch me by surprise that,
mm,
that night I would be stretching or eating dinner or something, and I think like, "Oh, wow, I haven't felt my pelvic floor in years," and
yeah,
it would just kinda catch me by surprise. And so I would talk about it, with who I was climbing with, especially, one of my really good climbing partners was one of the people that had, prolapse issues as well.
mhm,
And so we would talk about it and be like, "Oh, like, maybe we should stop right now because this is kind of hurting," and she had 2 kids, and hers got a lot worse after the 2nd.
mhm,
Um, so and I don't think and mine never got quite as good as hers. So we were able to just go back and forth, and that was kinda nice because
yeah,
to tell someone, "I can't try that because of my pelvic floor,"
right,
90% of the people are gonna be like, "Wha" they would be like me, like, "What is even a pelvic floor?" Right? Like,
right.
no one even knew what that was, and especially this last year, I've had a injury to my pelvic floor, and I feel like I was so open about it, and probably 90% of the people were like, "What? I don't even know what that is," and I was like, "Neither did I."
Yeah. No, every time you post on Instagram and then you had an article in oh gosh, I'm blanking. Was it the New York Times? It was
Yeah,
something. What was it?
yeah,
Yep, the New
yeah,
York Times. You've just been incredibly open about it. And it's for somebody in my space where this is our day job to have someone where it's not their day job talk about it, we realize the vulnerability that requires. Um, so thank you, first of all, for being so open because again, like what's the feedback been when you put that out there? Like how many DMs you get back? You're like, what the heck? Oh my God, I think I have this. Like,
yeah. No, I feel like, for the most part, it's a connecting issue, right? It's like it connects all of us because then
yeah.
I hear from people that either have similar issues or they know someone or something like
Hmm.
that. And a lot of it's been really heartwarming to be like, oh, my mom mentioned that a long time ago, but there was
Hmm.
no treatment back then or whatnot. And it's interesting because yeah, maybe I should feel a little bit. weird about it, but honestly, for me, I just go back to that time when I felt so alone and ashamed by it, that I'm like, if somebody was talking about it, because
Right.
most sports injuries that, again, your male counterparts can relate to are visible, right? It's like, oh,
Right.
I hurt my shoulder or I broke my ankle. I mean, even concussions to a point you can kind of understand. But when
Yeah.
you're talking about the pelvic floor, people, they
Right.
can't see it,
Right.
so you have to trust the people that they are experiencing pain. So I just feel like it's something that it's better to put out there, and it's totally, it's real, right? Like, it
Yeah.
impacts my day-to-day life, it impacts my career, and so why not talk about it?
Yeah. No, I totally appreciate that again because so many people I think turn to voices that they respect and follow, especially these days. And, the more that they hear that, they can kind of have the courage to kind of have those conversations of their own and reach out to providers and things like that. So there's so much benefit to that. But also, as you have experienced, like a lot of confusion, like, why is this happening now? What does this have to do with shifting hormones, all that kind of stuff? Maybe you could share a little bit about kind of how hard that's been to navigate.
Yeah, no, totally. So for me, it caught me by surprise again, in that I had experienced that like 9-year honeymoon period. Um, and so a year ago, I had an injury to my pelvic floor, and I was just flabbergasted because I thought, wait, I had checked that box, like I was good
Hmm.
there. And so then to understand that with the low, the diving of hormone levels, the pelvic floor can thin, and it can like totally be impacted by perimenopause. It was a real eye opener for me. Um, and honestly, that pelvic floor PT has come so far,
Yeah.
because it doesn't feel like, maybe if it was my mom or something who'd had kids, over 40
Yeah.
years ago, I'd be like, oh, of course it's come a far long ways. But I'm like, I just did it, 8 or 9
Right.
years ago. It wasn't
Yeah.
that long ago. How
No.
how can it switch? Because it's like you hurt your shoulder, and it's roughly the same, physical therapy that I got,
Right.
like 10 or 15 years ago. Maybe there's like a
Yep.
couple new exercises, but it's not totally transformed like
Yep.
pelvic floor health has, I feel like.
Yeah. No, I mean 10, and again, my kids are 11 and 13. Like, even with prolapse, I feel like back then we were just starting to shift from, oh, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that, to shifting over to, actually, no, we want you to be stronger. We want you to be more active. We want to dose exercise, things like that. Which again, not that long ago. Which it's exciting, but it's also like, okay, well, if I can do this, like there's a lot of gray area and a lot of problem solving that has to go. And even finding providers to talk to you about things. I mean, you live in an area that's kind of remote. How hard is it to find a provider to have conversations about?
Oh, it's so hard. It took me forever, 10 years ago to find a pelvic floor
Yeah.
PT, and then, she moved. And so then, to find other people has been really hard.
Yep.
Especially people that kind of understand what you want to get back to, instead of
Right.
just like, oh, you just go on walks now instead of run, or,
Right.
just keep it keep it within the pain range and you'll be fine.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's really hard, honestly, and it's like, I feel like too, to find providers that are willing to kind of understand and to know what you want to get back to is really
Hmm.
hard, because it's like
Yeah.
some people are like, well, we'll get you to this level, but but since you're in your mid 40s now, you don't really need to get back to that next level, and you're kind of like, well, I'd like to try at least.
Yeah. You're like, tell me I can. Like,
Yeah,
go ahead, try. Tell me I can.
exactly.
No, and that's the thing again. The generation that we're in, I don't know if are you are you Gen X, or are you next one, whatever comes
I'm
after that
I'm
Y?
1980, so I don't even know what that is.
I don't know. I feel like you're on the cusp.
Okay, I'm
Either
on the
way,
cusp.
we'll
Yeah.
adopt you in Gen X.
Okay.
Anyway, no, I feel like we really were that generation that witnessed kind of almost like the inactivity of or the lack of allowance of activity of the generations of women before us, and then we've sort of threaded the needle in between, and now we're like, okay, we want to keep pushing this, we want to keep doing this. How can we do this? And we need help, and we need support, and we need research, and we need all of these things. And everybody's kind of just coming up behind us and being like, yeah, okay, let's go. But I do feel like for women, it's there's been a huge surge at least in my career for sure. Did you have a family that climbed that were able to use for role models, or did that come from outside your family?
My dad climbed when he was a kid. My grandfather was in the military, so he grew
Hmm.
up for a big portion of his childhood in Europe. And Europe, climbing just has a much longer and deeper history. Um, it's a fairly new sport in the states. Like when I started in the mid '90s, um, there was like a dozen or 2 dozen climbing gyms throughout the country was it, and now
Hmm.
they're just everywhere.
Everywhere, yeah.
Everywhere. Every major metropolitan area will have like a dozen you can choose from. Um, so my dad kinda got it, but my mom doesn't like heights at all. She's terrified of them. So she wasn't a climber. But, I think but they were just so supportive, right? Like,
Hmm.
they weren't soccer parents, so they
Hmm.
weren't ones that were living out their dreams through me,
Hmm.
uh, climbing was my thing. They would totally facilitate, any travel I needed to competitions or help or whatnot. But it was totally my deal, which now I'm pretty thankful for. And same, like they've just been really like I feel pretty darn lucky with my family and my folks in that way. But they weren't professional climbers. Nobody, it's kind of a new thing, professional
Yeah,
climbers. So yeah, it's like we're all just kind of like
you're
making
winging
our
it.
own way. Yeah, we're just like,
Loving
I don't
it.
know, might as well just keep trying this, and at some point it'll stop, and then something else will happen.
That's so cool. No,
Yeah.
I had no idea about the history in of climbing in Europe, and you go and climb, or you do bouldering a lot in France quite a bit. And what is first of all, what is it that makes like climbing there different than climbing here? And then how, because you've climbed all over the world, how has climbing changed for you since being that teenager that you're going all over the world, and now when you go and climb with your friends or do bouldering in France, like what's changed?
Um, yeah, I feel like for me it's much less like singular. Like I'm much broader in my climbing, if that makes sense. Whereas before I'd have like a single objective and I'd want to go achieve that objective. And now I just want to climb. Like I love climbing. And I know a lot of people, the best thing I can liken it to is, a lot of people love yoga because it just like feels
Mhm,
good on their body. And that's how climbing feels to me. It just like
mhm.
feels really good on my body. Um, so yeah, traveling, around the world now, I'm pretty picky on where I go. I'm pretty specific, and at least the place we go to in France, it's like the most fun climbing I can imagine, and so that kind of fills me up these days. Like climbing is a lot of climbing can be pretty masochistic, especially like climbing on El Cap and stuff. It's just like it's painful, and you gotta really put your body through the ringer. And so I feel like I did that a lot in my career, and now I'm
Mhm.
like I'd rather have a little bit more fun climbing than the
What makes for fun climbing other than the fact there's a bakery down the street?
yeah. Um, It's like the volume of climbing
Mm,
is amazing, the volume of quality climbing. It's interesting. That's one thing that I love about climbing is, the problem solving aspect to it,
mm,
right? You have this series of holds, and you need to figure out how you can put them together with your body and your ability to get to the top, and I really
mhm,
like that. So it's really interesting climbing. It's
mhm.
friendly in that, like, the actual rock is sandstone, so it's shaped in really friendly, ergonomic ways. So yeah, I really like it there.
I never thought of a rock as friendly, but now I'm going to.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's super cool. No, I learned a lot, read this book this year. I learned a lot about you, obviously, and climbing. What was it like to kind of, um, pull your life story together in a book, and you do talk a bit about your navigating pelvic health and stuff towards the end. What was this process like? Because it's taken a little bit to finish the book. Yes.
Yeah, yeah, I'm not a natural writer. So, yeah, it took a long time. I feel like as any parent during COVID can relate, like, I had 0 productivity while there was, like, Zoom school, which was
Mm-hmm.
basically, yeah. So,
Mm-hmm.
I had 0 productivity during those years, so that was kind of a hiatus. But honestly, I think that especially talking about the postpartum stuff and especially talking about, um, the inequity between women and men in the community, I just feel like I would have needed it so much, right? I needed it at different times in my career. And so it felt good to finally get that out there, that it
Yeah.
was to talk about the stuff that so many of us experience, but then feel very nervous to talk about, right? Because
Yeah.
for good reason, it's like vulnerable. It's rare to hear. Maybe you're putting yourself out there a little more than you're comfortable with, but honestly, I think that's kind of what brings us together. That's what I relate most to. Like if
Hmm.
I'm talking to somebody or reading somebody's story or watching you know, a movie, that's kind of the human stories are what I relate to.
Yeah, no, and that definitely came through. I was so pleased at the part obviously after you had your son, you were quite open about sharing all that. And again, it's in this time period of last year there were a lot of runner profiles that came out, Lauren Fleshman, Kara Goucher. I felt like yours just fell right in line with all of that of just sharing, hey, there was a lot of inequities here. We're making the best way that we can and we're going to continue to be open about this. Um, do you see yourself now as like an advocate for women in climbing, or how do you kind of place yourself now as your role?
Yeah, I feel like, I'm not pushing the physical limits of climbing anymore. I'm in my mid 40s and the next generation is doing an amazing job at doing at that. Um, but I do feel like I'm working with my sponsors and working with the companies that, I'm associated with to try and make it a more equitable place,
Mhm,
for women, for people that have been underrepresented, because it's just going to make climbing in our community that much broader and stronger if
mhm,
people feel welcomed here, if they feel welcome to pursue different paths that haven't been pursued or that have been once thought of as taboo to go down.
yeah,
And obviously, like, I can talk to and help with my experiences, but I think just even getting that stuff out there,
mhm,
um, then makes it a little bit easier for other people to talk about their stories and things that they've
yeah.
experienced as well.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking of some of the challenges like with ultra running, having feminine products available, lactation stations, things like that. What are the challenges? I can't even wrap my head around that with climbing. What are the challenges that face women in general with climbing, and then for moms specifically?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's it's possible to do all this stuff. It's just like more logistics, right? And
Yeah.
so it's just, like, much more logistically complicated. Like, anytime I was on LCAP and I had my period, it's just like it's just one more thing, right? Because you're like, "Oh, I have to bring the tampons and I have to," like, all this stuff because it's not like there's a garbage can up there or whatnot.
No.
Um, and so it's just, like, more logistics for that type of thing, and just honestly being I think one of the biggest things that I've seen in the past 5 years is the training space and
Mm,
seeing how the different phases of your cycle affect your training. And it's been so great to see the younger generation talking about that, like how
mhm,
it affects their how brave they feel, right? Or
mm,
if they're in one phase they feel like more timid or whatnot. And so I feel like just getting that out in the open it's been pretty amazing. To see and to see that the next generation taking that on, because I mean now, like, I don't have a cycle anymore, so I feel like now it's like, okay, now we need to talk about the perimenopause stuff. Like, what happens when you don't have all these phases and that type
Right?
of thing, you know?
You're like, "Wait, it's a whole different logistics, isn't it?"
Exactly.
So since there's nobody in that space for you to necessarily look up to, from a pro standpoint, like, what are the conversations now that you're having with other women who are climbing and navigating perimenopause and menopause? Like, what do those conversations look like?
For honestly, it's just I think it's probably what society is talking about because the menopause conversation is just so new. Like the medical
Mhm.
community wasn't even educated on
Yeah.
menopausal women because we weren't needed anymore. Um, and so I feel like it's just what everybody's doing. Like, are you taking hormones? If so, like, what is helping? What are just kind of all the things like, how are you surviving this type of
Yep.
thing? To try and gather information of what might help us. But when I was post pregnant and then postpartum, I worked with a couple doctors on doing a study of, or a survey of women in climbing and
Mhm.
pregnancy. And so I'm working with those doctors again to try and do something with, perimenopause and to see
Mhm.
what's happening with, what do climbers actually experience, and what's happening with their bodies and what is working for them.
That's so cool. No, again, we need more data, more women in research asking the questions for sure. When people ask you, is it mostly just a conversation between friends? Is it on the book tour? Like when do these questions come up?
Gosh, I feel like I get DMs about it, honestly. And then yes, people will walk up to me and talk to me on the book tour, and then friends. So I feel like it's honestly women are hungry for it because
Yeah.
there's just not that much out there, and it's just again, no one talked about it, right? Like, I don't know, did your mom talk about it? My mom never did, And so none of us know what to expect really. And, is this normal?
No.
Is that normal type of thing? So
Yeah.
just to even hear from friends or strangers that of their experiences is it feels like it's a little less alone again.
I'm glad you say that because I worry that it's just me that I get into these conversations all the time. I
No,
was
not at all.
literally Thanksgiving weekend, I was backstage at the Kennedy Center. My daughter was singing and there was a couple other moms. We were the parents on duty. And I got to talking to one mom and we were talking about dance and she was a dancer and I said I was a PT. I had worked with dancers at one point and then somehow we shifted over and we're talking about perimenopause and leakage and jump rope it and just like is that just me that has these conversations
No,
backstage at
not
the
at all.
Kennedy Center?
Not at all. No, I mean, yeah, I feel like I talk about it with almost so many women,
I
like
love that.
when I had my like when I first had the pelvic floor injury last year, I was like walking around with like this little crash pad, this tiny little mat that we
Mhm.
used for climbing. And I would just have to like lay down everywhere I went. And people would ask me, like these young, really strong, amazing climbers are like, what's going on, Beth? And I'd tell them, and they were so interested to hear about it
Yeah,
because even now, they're 20, and so they're privy to all the information that we weren't privy to, but they're
right.
like, "Oh, I had no idea that could still
Yeah,
happen to you so long." And I was like, "Yeah, perimenopause." And they're like, "Oh, like what's going?" And they were so
yeah.
hungry for it too, just like we are, and we're
Yep,
in it. And so I think it's just it doesn't have to be only our generation or whatnot. It
yeah.
can, I would have been really interested at 20 to know, it's like
Yeah.
what am I in store for?
Right. Well, even if you don't completely get it, the fact that you've introduced that to somebody, it's not going to disappear. If it comes back up, they'll be like, "Oh, well, I talked to Beth about this. She mentioned this." And so it's again full circle getting caught off guard. We're trying to prevent that. And ideally, 10 years from now, we'll be in an even better place than we are now for sure. So
Yeah.
no, that's great that they listen to and have you to at least have that conversation with them. Be like, all right, I'm gonna rip the band-aid off and tell you like it is.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, just to let you know.
Right? Oh my gosh. So what's next for you? You had the big, book drop this year and the book tour. What's kind of ahead for you next?
This is like the first time that I can kind of remember in my professional adult life that I don't have a big project like on the horizon.
Mhm.
And I'm kind of actually excited for that
Yeah.
because I feel like that quiet space is kind of when you have creative things happen,
Yeah.
or you're able to think more about it. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm just kind of like trying to lean into that a little bit.
That sounds awesome. And then is your son he's finishing up elementary this year and then middle school, or how's it work out there?
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Exactly. So this is our
So
last year.
hold space for that.
Exactly. Yeah, I was just with
Trust
somebody
me.
I was just with somebody who has a 12-year-old, and she said, "Oh boy." And I was like, "Okay, here we go."
Mhm.
I'm not ready, but I know it's coming.
No. You long for the days when they were little and just complained about snacks and things like that. No, both of mine this year, same school, both middle school. And, taking world geography over again, and then, like, I feel like I'm taking all their classes with them.
Yeah.
Like,
No,
"Oh,
that's
algebra, we
coming.
know." Yeah, no, that's not for the faint of heart for sure.
Yeah. Yeah,
Alright,
totally.
well, I'm glad you're holding space for that. Alright, at the end of every episode, we ask a couple of questions. So first one, a book you're reading or a podcast that you're listening to right now?
Um, I've been really devouring the Elizabeth Strout books, and
Ooh, what's that?
so she's just this novelist and amazing.
Okay,
Um, and so the current one I'm reading is, I think, one of her first actually is Olive Kittredge. But I'm just kind of like, I go to the library and whichever one I have there at the
I
time.
gotcha.
But she does just such a great job. Again, like, it's a fictional book.
Mhm.
Um, but I just feel like the characters are so human and so raw, and I just love that.
It's good
Again, like, I
writing.
love I love the human experience even though they're not real people. It feels so relatable. So, yeah,
Love
I
it.
love I love anything she writes.
Is it like deep read? Is it like summer read? Or I have friends now that are totally into dragon smut, which is like it's a whole other thing. So it sounds like it's kind of somewhere in the middle there.
Yeah, I feel like it's, like, in between deep and summer. Like, it's not something that I read in a day, but it's
Okay.
not something where I'm just like, "Whew, I gotta take a break." I'm kind of like,
Okay.
I wanna read it every night.
Okay, good. And it sounds like good writing too. I have no tolerance for poor writing. I think that's one of the things I messaged you one time. I'm like, I love your book and it's great. It's really written well.
Yeah, totally.
One of the bad things about having an English teacher for a dad. So all right. We're gonna tweak this question a little bit. Original question is favorite activity since becoming a mom. We're gonna say favorite activity since becoming a perimenopausal mom.
Oh, yeah. Gosh, I'd still have to say it's climbing. Um,
Love
yeah,
it.
yeah, I love it. Followed closely by running, and I haven't run hardly at all in the last year. Slowly starting to, but it's followed closely by running. But if I had to pick between the two, I'd probably
It's
go
gonna be
climbing.
climbing. I
Yeah,
wouldn't
it's
expect
gonna be
a different answer. I
climbing.
wouldn't expect a different answer. All right. For climbing moms specifically, what one piece of advice would you have for them?
Somebody gave this to me, and I didn't really get it. So this is for climbing specific moms, that
Mhm.
the rocks will always be there. Um,
Mm.
'Cause I just felt like, those weeks that you're in bed with the newborn or whatever, you're just like, like, my life is passing before my eyes. And it's just like, well, the rocks are going to be there. Like, whether you start climbing again next week or in 5 years
Mhm.
or in 10 years. And that really helped, honestly. It kind of put it in perspective because they're
What
still here now.
what's so funny is the interview I did right before you with Jessica Dorrington. I asked her that question, and her version, she works with pro runners and things like that. She's like, "Running will always be there." I'm like, "Ooh, we have a theme today.
Yeah.
We have a theme."
Yeah. It'll
All right,
always be there.
in the climbing space, and you may or may not have anybody here, like who should we pay attention to, either pregnancy, postpartum, or perimenopause? Are there any voices out there that are people we should be paying attention to?
I don't know her personally, but her Instagram handle is climbing with joy. I think you had
Yeah,
her on. Yeah.
she's been on the podcast. Yeah, Joy
Yeah,
Black.
yeah, you
Mhm.
had her on.
Yep.
And, all the women and my friends that are now, so, they're like a decade or
Mhm.
15 years, below me, they all
Yep.
work with her, and
Yep.
they just speak so highly of her. So I would say that, she has a ton of experience, and she works with, you know, real climbers and people that wanna
Yep.
get back. So I only hear good things about her.
That's awesome. No, and she's been very, instrumental in taking a lot of stuff that we're pulling from other sports and kind of adapting it.
Yeah.
And really just making climbing accessible for pregnant and postpartum athletes. I'm excited to see, as she gets closer to, where we are, how that adapts for an aging athlete or masters athlete, we'll call us,
Yeah.
and see what that looks like. I don't like aging at all.
Yeah.
That's why I use the word vintage. I'm like, vintage sounds much nicer.
Totally.
All right. And then last one for you. What does it mean to you to be an active mom?
That's a good question. Gosh, just being able to not be in pain in my body and just move around, whatever that is, whether it's doing a little bit of yoga, whether it's doing my pelvic floor exercises, whether it's climbing, whether it's running, hiking, just, being able to move my body and not feel pain too much.
I love that. I think that's the dream, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
That's the dream. All right. If you want to follow Beth, you can find her over on Instagram at Beth Rodden. If you want to check out her book, we've got it here, Light Through the Cracks. I've even got mine autographed. It's in there. Thanks so much, Beth, for sharing your story, being so open about kind of your experience. And thanks so much for joining me on the show.
Thank you so much, and thank you for all you do in this space. It's invaluable.
Always. Thanks. If you're navigating pregnancy, postpartum, or perimenopause, whether personally or professionally, check out all our free resources and upcoming courses at carriepagliano.com. This podcast reflects the opinions of Dr. Carrie Pagliano and her guests, and it is for entertainment purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. Always consult your healthcare provider with any medical questions. If you enjoyed the episode, please take a moment to leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform. And thanks for listening.